So the cartel war south of the border is absolutely wild. I mean, I had no idea that sometimes state, local, and federal forces are fighting alongside some cartels against others. Not like material support behind the scenes, but like literally side by side in a firefight shooting in the same direction, which seems like, a bit of a problem. So today we're getting an update on all things cartels, and for that we're turning to an expert. Stefano Rittendale runs All Source News on X or Twitter, which focuses on cartel violence in Mexico, Latin American affairs, the drug trade, and organized crime. He is also the chief intelligence officer of Artorias, a pretty cool new AI-driven intelligence company. Now, Stefano's information can all be found in the description below, so be sure to give him a follow for all things cartel related. And with that, here's our conversation. All right, Stefano, thanks so much for taking the time, man. Looking forward to a little bit of update here on the cartels. So this has been a focus area of the Trump administration, I would say.
hmm
And we've seen a lot of talk. We've seen some executive orders. We've seen troops move down to the border. We've seen
hmm
some military intelligence gathering flights in areas that maybe we hadn't seen before. From your perspective, have we seen much of a change from the cartels responding to any of that?
You know, that's kind of an interesting question, right? What are the cartels? And I think just for our listeners to understand, if I may, I think it's very important to highlight one key thing. When we're talking about cartels, these are very much independent groups, right? Because a lot of times when the media talks about it, they try to do this like overlapping term as cartels, as if they all have similar agendas, et cetera. And I think it's important to highlight that that's not the case. Each independent one has different goals, different ways they operate, different areas of control, different leadership. And 99% of the time, the cartel's rivals are actually other cartels. So they fight each other against a lot. So with that kind of in mind, I think a lot of the reaction we saw, if there was any, and I would admit that it was small.
Okay.
There was small reactions. We haven't really seen that much change. I will highlight two specific ones. So the Gulf Cartel, right, that they are really much in northeast Mexico, from Brownsville, Texas, kind of all the way up to McAllen. The Gulf Cartel has been having a civil war for years and years and years between two factions, right? You have the Scorpion Group out of Matamoros, which borders Brownsville, and then you have the Metros, who are allied with another cartel called the Jalisco New Generation, but the Metros are based out of Reynosa, which borders kind of McAllen. The reaction we saw because of the FTO designation, that not directly or mostly because of it, but the FTO designation or the threat of the FTO designation definitely played a role, was we saw a ceasefire was announced between both
Okay.
groups, right? It looked like the state government in Mexico, the Tamaulipas, where they're fighting, and the Mexican federal government really put some political pressure on these guys. And both factions understood, okay, we can't just operate as we've been operating with this new thing going on. So they announced this ceasefire. We saw some reports, and again, for those who monitor cartels, it's kind of hard to get solid confirmation. That's one of the hardest things to really do with cartels. But the Scorpion Group, they pulled, apparently the leadership kind of did pull out of the border, right? They went further down into a state called San Luis Potosí, which is further down from the border, because of the concern of, okay, this FTO designation. We did see that.
Hmm.
Besides that, there really wasn't much reactions. The only other one, he's a good friend of mine. His name is Mika Trevino. I talked to him. He's another good cartel account, observer account, a good reporter. He kind of mentioned how one of the cartels in the Sinaloa cartel called Los Chapitos is a faction. They're based out of Sinaloa, Culiacan specifically. They're also in a civil war with a rival. He was telling me how the leadership of Los Chapitos kind of felt that worst comes to worst, and they didn't even think it was going to happen. The U.S. might bomb some drug labs, which
Really?
for the cartels is like, whatever. That's an acceptable loss. We don't care. Drug labs get raided all the time. And definitely it's not going to really change. They really thought that they were going to receive protection from the federal government, or that the federal government would try to prevent that kind of U.S. unilateral military actions. Taking away from that, not much has changed. It's been very much standard. And if you analyze it from kind of the cartel's perspective, it kind of makes sense, because we're really not going to see the 82nd Airborne Division do like an air assault or airdrop into a Mexican city. I mean, I okay, you got me there. I'll give you that one. But I think it's logical to think that's not going to happen. And so the cartels they view their rivalry as a greater threat than the US military action. And I think that's kind of why they haven't been given a reason to change in any way, and we haven't seen any changes.
Interesting. Okay, so I do have some questions about kind of the
Mhm,
connection with the Mexican government,
mhm,
and I think I'm going to come back to that because there was an article in CNN that caught my attention
mhm,
today. It just would have slipped by, but since we were
mhm.
talking, I was like, oh, that's okay. We got to grab this. It's talking about how the CIA is reviewing authorities to use legal force against the cartels. I'll just read the first portion here.
Mhm.
It says the CIA is reviewing its authorities to use lethal force against drug cartels in Mexico and beyond as the Trump administration moves to make taking the cartels a major priority. The review does not indicate Trump has ordered the CIA to take direct action, but it is designed to help the agency understand the kinds of activities it could legally take and the potential risks. So we're
Mhm.
talking about, of course,
Yeah.
82nd jumping into a Mexican city, but is this is there a higher likelihood of something like this? I don't even know if I would call this covert action, but
Mhm.
something a little softer, maybe.
I think, I mean, I know from people that I've talked to and sources, planning has been going on for a
Sure.
very, very long time. I think everybody's waiting the win. I would fall within that camp. It's not if, but when.
Hmm.
Um, but again, it's speculation. And anytime I make a post about anything related to the Trump administration, I think there's a clear caveat and understanding that it can change in a heartbeat, right? That's just the nature of the
Yeah.
thing. And to be honest, if you're a cartel member, you're kind of on your foot about that. But again, we haven't really seen a reaction from the cartels and all the messaging groups I track in social media. Now, I do believe that, if an action comes down, I was on a different podcast and I kind of mentioned where I would think the areas of focus and targeting would be on key figures within the cartel common supply chain and command structure that's really designed and are enablers, key enablers for drugs into the United States, right? You're talking about chemical brokers, you're probably talking about your logisticians, you're talking about key leadership that control territory that is key for drug production and distribution. And I think those are the kind of the areas that we would focus on. But the caveat I would say is, obviously we can always demand more from the Mexican government. The Mexican government can do more. I think nobody's going to disagree with that. But the Mexican government does target a lot of those people, right? They generally do. And I think what we need to have an understanding is generally these cartels are very resilient organizations. And they can take a hit, they can take a blow, and they even understand that's standard business. Like it's kind of like in their mindset, a kind of weird business-like mindset, if you were to think about this. It's for them, it's kind of like an acceptable loss in many
Hmm.
aspects, right? And how they operate. And then they have redundancies to ensure that although there might be a degradation, they continue to function. And I think that's kind of the thing. It would be interesting. I mean, we won't know until it happens, really, when an attack happens and then they target somebody or they target a facility, et cetera. But I wouldn't necessarily believe that the focus or my recommendation, if I was advising the president, is like, Mr. President, don't target the drug labs. They're very rudimentary and it's not complicated to see. If you kind of
Mhm.
look at the videos out there, they are not these Breaking Bad level 5 labs with all these machines. It's just a hut, a tent, some barrels, and the chemicals, and they're making it. You can bomb it.
Sure.
Is it really going to change much? No, they'll just move somewhere else. And there even is speculation that a lot of times the cartels themselves will give coordinates of these drug labs so that the pressures kind of push off on them. They
Ah,
kind of, yeah, yeah, that there's a game,
yeah.
right? So the cartel might say, "Oh, we're getting targeted because of XYZ. Okay, we need to give the Mexican government a win or the state government a win. Here's the coordinates of these drug labs. Go get them."
They're
And it's
smart.
interesting. It is. And what's interesting is though, 99% of the times the Mexican government raise a drug lab specifically in these remote areas, zero arrests. I mean, at some point you got to capture somebody some of the times, but you
Okay,
don't see
that
that.
yeah, that's a good lead in here to
Yeah.
another question, which is an outsider looking in, what's
Mhm.
the level of complicity or corruption with, and I understand we're talking about an entire nation and a lot of federal and state
Mhm.
agencies, but I think that the general view from the United States is that the cartels have the power, or from, an ignorant American, if you
Yeah.
will. The cartels have the power and the government can't do anything. Is it that significant? Or I mean, what's this going on with the
Yeah.
raids and no arrests? That sounds like it's a little bit silly.
So let me address the corruption piece, right?
Yeah.
Because I would agree with you. So again, you highlighted local, state, federal. And you can have like, for example, in Sinaloa right now, right? Especially when the Civil War started. So two factions of the Sinaloa cartel, they're called the Mallito Flacos and Los Chapitos, are at civil war. When the Civil War happened and the Mexican government responded, you actually ran into a situation where the federal level supported Los Mallito Flacos. It was pretty clear. Like the federal government and the military was supporting the Mallito Flacos,
A cartel.
the cartel exactly, in
Interesting.
the Civil War.
Yeah.
And the state government, though, and the state police had a long history of collaborating with the Chapitos, right? And so I talk a lot about this in the corruption aspect, right? And how do I say it? So you run into a situation at the local, state, and federal level. Yes, the cartels have the power and they have the control, and they support political candidates, and they even the judiciary. I think is very important. The corruption within the judiciary, and they leverage that, right? And you in an election season, you might run into a situation where one political candidate has support of a cartel, and another political candidate has the support of a rival cartel, and that kind of translates then the violence in some of the elections that we see, et cetera.
Huh.
So and I would agree with you that in a lot of aspects, yes, you can look at it from an angle of the cartel has the power. And that's the key word you use that I want to leverage for this. Yes, there are cases where the cartel have the power and they leverage that for corruption for their own interests and their own economic and even political interests. But I think it's important to highlight it also happens the other way around, right? Where the corruption doesn't start at the cartel level corrupting a government official. It's a political office leadership, a high level organ specifically, that is the corrupt official, and he has the power. And he dictates to the cartel what he wants in return. He can
Okay.
tell the cartel, I want you to fund my political campaign. I want you to assassinate my political rival. I want kickbacks and any money you can make. I want complete control of this area. And if you do not support me, and if you do not do what I say, I'm sending the military after you. And so you also and I think that's something that's very important, where corruption is held at the high level and it's pushed down to the cartel, and the power and the enforcement of that corruption is not the cartel up, it's the political leader down. You saw that with a former Army Mexican general who was in charge of the army, Cienfuegos. Clear as day, he killed a cartel member who paid the general, and he sent the special forces after, and the guy surrendered, and they executed him point blank. And the general said, I'm done with them. We're moving on to somebody else.
Jesus.
Right. And that is something also that happens. And the problem you're running into in Mexico is the anti-corruption piece,
Hmm.
because the most effective anti-corruption body in Mexico, for all intents and purposes, is the Southern District of New York. The prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. They're the most effective anti-corruption. They're the ones that really hold Mexican government officials accountable. So you're not going to see it for Mexico.
It's interesting because I think when we're triggered to hear corruption and think bad, it's got to go away. But there's all of these little intricate pieces where a politician could say, "I won't arrest you if there's no violence in the southern portion of my town." And
Exactly.
like, listen, the locals are probably like, "That's great, fine, just move it out there. I don't really care. I'm safe now." So like, technically, that's corruption. It's not the maybe the money changing hands that we're thinking of, but I imagine when you get down to the local level, it's almost
Here's a
impossible to
here,
set
here's
apart.
a here's a perfect example of that. Perfect example. When I told you earlier here when the Gulf Cartel, that civil war between the Scorpion Group and the Metros, right? Shortly after the announcement, we saw a significant deployment, specifically the Tamaulipas State Police. And if we it was geolocated where they were at. That is literally the front line between the both cartels. And it was the police force acting as peacekeepers to enforce this ceasefire. That happens because, to your point, in many cases, I think, the Mexican government's number one priority is security. Now, that could mean, okay, this cartel is getting out of hand. We have to go after them. We have to eliminate them, right? The Zetas, a perfect example, that happened, right? And that does happen. The
Mhm.
Rihanna Felix organization or the Tijuana cartel, that happened. But a lot of times we just want peace and stability. So does that mean when there's violence between cartels, do we go in as peacekeepers to stop the violence? Or as the example in Sinaloa's case, which side do they pick in the war? We saw that in Michoacan, for example, I have videos of Mexican military and police officials fighting side by side with the United Cartels, which is now an FTO designated group, against CJNG, right? And
Real quick,
so, yeah.
when you say fighting side by side, I just want to make sure I have this mental image correct. You're not saying like behind the scenes they're supporting them maybe with intel. You're talking about like literally on the ground shooting next to each other in the same
Both,
direction.
all the above. But the
That's
videos I have
wild.
is side by side. You see
Yeah.
the police officer, you see the cartel member, and they're battling out. You have videos of cartel enforcers going on a town side by side with the police, and they don't mess with each other, right? You see that?
Yeah.
But yeah, that does happen. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's something that I think people need to kind of understand. And it's to your point, though. I think the Mexicans government, and this is kind of ever since the war on drugs was declared, the war on cartels more specifically, right, in 2006, it's there's always this attempt by any administration to portray a sense of common normalcy. And what you actually see is, I would even argue the Mexican government undercounts when there's fighting between the, let's say, a government of forces and the cartels. They undercount the casualties that occur, the members, the amount of people they killed on the Mexican cartel side, right? So
Hmm.
in January 2023, there was the famous Culiacanazo. They went after one of El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman. The city just went berserk, war zone. I think the Mexican government announced, if memory serves me correct, I think they said 18 members of Los Chapitos were killed. That's a lie. I have one video of two trucks full of bodies that easily is 15, if not 20 people,
Yeah.
right? But they lied to the public because they want to portray this image of, yes, the violence happened, but in grand scheme of things, not that many people died. It's safe, it's secure. And that's why also a reasoning why sometimes the Mexican military, when they deploy to areas, they don't deploy a lot of times with their up armored vehicles because the Mexican military has tanks, they have APCs, but a lot of times they don't deploy them because then it becomes that perception of, are we actually in a war zone? And we don't want our citizens to feel like it. And it's harder to make that argument if you have military personnel rolling in tanks in a
Yeah.
city. So that's a problem that we also see.
That was something that we dealt with in the last 25 years, Iraq and Afghanistan. Is it better to show up looking like this or with full kit and body armor and you come across a little intimidating? In that sense, is looking at the Taliban or Al Qaeda or Islamic State, that counterinsurgency type mindset, is that an appropriate comparison here?
In some ways, I think there are comparisons, and I think it's important to highlight one thing. I've made this argument very much so that you generally hear people argue, the war on cartels or the militarization of the drug war was a mistake, and I can understand that. And I don't want to get into the domestic politics of that or the political aspect, and I can understand that argument. But what I would counter is the cartels don't care; they're militarizing anyways. They're
Wait,
militarizing
wait, what is the argument that a war on cartels is a bad thing? Are you saying
because
that's
it
an argument in
caused
Mexico?
because it caused violence to go up. So
Oh, okay.
by deploying the military and taking this very hard approach against the cartels, it actually caused homicides to go up and violence to go up. And generally, that's what we've seen is violence consistently goes up in Mexico. You have dips, but there's been, especially in the last two, this current administration in Mexico and the previous one, violence has really gone up. And so the argument is, well, see, the militarization of the drug war or the cartel war failed. And what I would counter with that is, well, cartels are militarizing. They are becoming territorial. And in many aspects, yes, I would agree with you that in some of the tactics and the tools and the fighting we see, you can kind of look at ISIS, the Taliban, et cetera, and you can see, at least in the warfare aspects, some similarities. Where the difference is, though, and I think this is very, and even in the corruption, right? In Afghanistan, the corruption
Hmm.
there, in Mexico, we can look that. But the difference I think is very important to highlight in Mexico compared to these other countries is kind of the political dimension, right? These are profit-oriented or terrorist organizations declared by Trump, cartels. They're very profit-oriented. They require territorial control to ensure that. But you're never going to see a cartel try to overthrow a government in its entirety. At the local level, you might see local officials flee, right?
Hmm.
And the cartel's going to come over. But from a grand scheme of thing of replacing a government, that is never the intent of a cartel. Actually, in the contrary, right? Mexican cartels need Mexican political government and even judicial systems to further their interest, right? They don't have the capability to replace that. They don't have that, and they don't want to. And you even see in some of the cartel propaganda, right, in the video statements they release, here and there, you actually see a video statement from, let's say, a perfect example, the Jalisco New Generation cartel. They'll make a video statement. Let's say they're in Tabasco, which is a very violent state, and they have a war with a gang called La Barredora. It's a gang there in Tabasco, and there's a very violent war. So you'll see these CJNG guys come up and release a video statement. And the messaging, sometimes it's actually directed at government officials, even up to, sometimes to the president, to say, hey, Madam President, this gang who's terrorizing the population is supporting these political leaders and these government officials. You need to send the police or the legal authorities to detain them, right? It's not, I want to overthrow the government. And I think that's the difference between both, that the Mexican cartels leverage the political system, leverage the judicial system, leverage the governance to expand their reach and authority and power, but don't want to, and nor do they have really the capabilities in many aspects to replace it. Maybe in some remote areas they do, absolutely. 30% of Mexico, the last intel estimate we got, 30% was under direct control of Mexican cartels, but those are very remote regions,
Sure.
extremely remote. But your larger cities, they have the presence, but they need the political institutions there to continue their activities.
This is kind of a specific one, but in thinking about the types of warfare and the weapons that we've seen employed in recent conflicts, I'm wondering if these have made their way to the cartels just because of the ease of use, but IEDs and
Mhm.
FPV drones specifically. All right, I'll just leave it at drones, big
So
picture.
drones, yes. FPV, no.
Okay.
I've yet to see an FPV example, and I think that kind of highlights kind of I think people, when you actually track cartels, their access to, let's say, rocket propelled grenades is not that vast comparative, like let's say the Taliban or ISIS, that everybody
Hmm.
there had it. That's not,
Yeah.
obviously it's there, but it's not in large quantities.
Yeah.
You actually see a lot more American armament, specifically from gunstrap purposes from the United States down, like your M82. The M82 to me would be an equivalent to a Taliban with an RPG-7.
Really?
So yeah, it's the M82 or those types of anti-material rifles or 50 cals. That's a heavy utilized weapon. FPVs we have not seen. We have not seen that. I think it's because of that. But what we have seen a significant increase in the last couple of years, and even this year, is the use of drones dropping explosives and even drones for reconnaissance purposes. Um, I can say I think at least up to 2018, if memory serves me correctly, was probably the first time. Don't quote me though. But now it has gone, and more importantly, you're starting to see it more and more and more on social media, especially drones dropping explosive devices. Um, we do have reporting of former Colombian soldiers who fought in Ukraine now on the payroll for Mexican cartels in Mexico, specifically Michoacan. It's the older profession, right? Mercenary, one of the oldest
Yeah.
professions out there to be a mercenary. We have seen that, and there is kind of this running theory that, at least, for example, the United cartels really vastly increased their use of drones dropping explosive. And there was kind of this theory, does that tie into some of these Colombians that actually ended up in Michoacan on the payroll of the United cartels? Did that show in a way to increase those capabilities? It's hard to really tell, but what is definitive, those capabilities have increased. And then from the terms of IEDs, yes. In January of 2025, actually the State Department released a do not travel for Tamaulipas, and one of the reasons they specified it because of the IEDs.
Really?
Now,
Okay.
yes, now the IEDs are very basic. They're not sophisticated. They're not like Iraq, Afghanistan, nowhere remotely near that. Very rudimentary, very basic, but nonetheless violent still.
The drone thing is interesting because you're talking about how it's hard to place it exactly. Do we tie it to these guys? Are they the ones that brought it over? But I think one of the biggest challenges with that type of technology moving around the world is you don't need somebody to teach you. I mean,
Exactly.
you and I can't fly a drone to save my life, but if I sat down in front of a computer long enough, there's enough footage out there to where I could
Mhm.
put together an FPV with some sort of modified warhead and actually make it work. So, whether or not those guys actually made their way to the cartels or they just got on their phone and pulled up
And they're
YouTube.
very rudimentary, the explosives they
Yeah.
drop. So, there's a difference. I think if you look at the images of the explosives that are used or seized, not in any way, shape, or form comparable to what do we see in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, these clearly look like a shed. They built it as quickly as possible, no regard to outcome. They just quickly did it. So, although the usage has increased, the sophistication is not at that level.
Gotcha. I mean, across the board sounds like absolute chaos south of the border. I feel like I know a little bit more about that chaos now, though, Stefano. So thank you very much. As we're wrapping up here, is there anything you're working on worth pitching? We'll link in the description below.
Yeah, no. So for those who don't know, I'm All Source News on Twitter. I also work I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. We'll soon be launching a consumer app that focuses on OSINT and news for everybody. And from a cartel perspective, I'm trying to reach out more to journalists and expand that. So if anybody here is listening, My DMs are always open. I'm always open to talk to anybody, assist in any projects, any commentary and everything. So I really appreciate Preston the time here, and this was great.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you again. Hey, so if you made it this far, first off, thank you. But also, let me know what you think. Good, bad, indifferent, more of this, less of this, longer, shorter. Any feedback is valuable here. I've got a couple more of these interviews scheduled this week, one focused on more Middle East issues, another on Ukraine. I'm going to try to do this where I talk to people like Stefano, who's clearly a subject matter expert in his field, knows infinitely more about this stuff than I do, to try to branch out a little bit. And, on the one hand, I get to learn in these conversations, but I feel like it'll also allow the channel to kind of cover different topics that maybe I otherwise wouldn't. Like this one in particular, diving into the stuff about the cartels would take me days or weeks to even get a fraction of the information that Stefano just rattled off in the course of a couple minutes. So anyways, let me know what you think. Keep this going, add more to it, scale them back, whatever it might be. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.